You snap at someone you love over something small. 20 minutes later, you drop your phone, spill your coffee, and get a call about a bill you forgot to pay. You laugh it off. Bad luck. But some part of you doesn't quite believe that. Or the other version. You help a stranger, change a tyre on the side of the road, running late, expecting nothing back. That same week, out of nowhere, something good lands in your lap. A job offer, a refund you didn't expect, a problem that solves itself. Coincidence, you say? And maybe it is. But you felt it too many times to fully believe your own explanation. That's the part nobody talks about. Not whether the pattern exists. Almost everyone has quietly noticed it. But why we've all agreed, without ever really deciding to call it nothing. Here's what almost nobody tells you. There was a civilization that didn't call it nothing. They didn't treat it as a feeling, or a coincidence, or a nice story to tell yourself. They treated it as law. Exact, unbreakable, no more optional than gravity. In this video, we're breaking down exactly how that worked. The invisible law they believe ran the universe. The terrifyingly precise system they built around it. Why holding it up next to modern physics feels less like mythology and more like an early draft of something real. And what it means for the choices you're making today, whether you believe in any of it or not. Let's start with what they called it. The Egyptians called it Ma'at. Most people who've encountered the word at all know it as the name of a goddess. Typically depicted with a single ostrich feather, associated with truth and justice. And that's accurate as far as it goes. But treating Ma'at as simply the goddess of justice badly undersells what the concept actually meant to the people who lived by it. Ma'at wasn't just a deity presiding over fairness, the way we might casually imagine a symbolic figure of justice today. Ma'at was the underlying order of the entire cosmos, the principle that kept the sun rising on schedule, kept the Nile flooding at the right time each year, kept the stars moving in their expected patterns, and kept human society from collapsing into chaos. It was simultaneously a cosmic force, a moral framework, and a literal operating law of reality, all understood as the same continuous thing, rather than three separate ideas loosely bundled together. Egyptian pharaohs took this seriously enough to make it central to their claim to rule at all. Part of the pharaoh's job in this framework wasn't just governing people, it was actively maintaining Ma'at, holding back the constant threat of Isfet, the concept of chaos and disorder that existed in direct opposition to it. Temples, rituals, even the architecture of Egyptian civilization were understood, at least in part, as tools for reinforcing this cosmic order against its constant tendency to unravel. This wasn't background theology nobody thought about day to day. It was treated as an active, ongoing responsibility. This is a genuinely different way of thinking about morality than most modern frameworks. In much of contemporary thought, moral behaviour and physical law are treated as entirely separate categories. Gravity doesn't care whether you're kind or cruel, and being a good person doesn't change how fast an object falls. For the Egyptians, this separation didn't exist in the same way. Living in accordance with Ma'at wasn't just an ethical preference. It was understood as living in alignment with the actual structural order of reality. Violating Ma'at wasn't simply being bad in some abstract moral sense. It was introducing disorder into a system that was believed to respond to that disorder, the same way pushing against a physical law produces a physical consequence. It's worth sitting with how unusual that framing really is by modern standards. We're used to thinking of the laws of physics and moral rules as belonging to entirely different departments of knowledge, taught by different teachers, tested by different methods, believed in for different reasons. The Egyptians didn't carve up reality that way. To them, asking, what happens if I break a moral rule? And what happens if I ignore a law of nature? Weren't fundamentally different questions. They were the same question aimed at the same underlying system, just applied to different parts of experience. This is what makes Ma'at so different from a lot of modern spiritual language, where concepts like good energy or bad energy tend to stay vague and unfalsifiable, more mood than mechanism. The Egyptians weren't describing a feeling, they were describing what they understood to be an actual operating principle. One specific enough that they built an entire afterlife judgment system around testing whether a person's life had in fact followed it. There's a reason this framing feels almost foreign to modern ears. We're used to a world where the priest and the scientist occupy entirely separate roles, working from entirely separate authorities. In Egypt, the same institutions that tracked the flooding of the Nile and the movement of celestial bodies were also responsible for maintaining moral and ritual order. Because to them, these weren't separate departments of knowledge at all. They were different faces of the same underlying system, studied by the same class of people, using the same basic assumption that reality at every level follows consistent rules worth understanding carefully. Which brings us to the part of this that sounds less like religion and more like a technical specification. The actual mechanics of how the Egyptians believed this law was enforced, in exacting, almost procedural detail. The Egyptian Book of the Dead is often described casually as a kind of ancient spiritual guidebook, general wisdom about death and the afterlife. That description isn't wrong, but it undersells how procedural and exact the actual content is. This wasn't a book of gentle suggestions. It was closer to an operating manual, with specific spells that needed to be performed in a specific order, using specific language to produce a specific outcome. Many of the spells in the Book of the Dead are explicit about this precision. Certain phrases had to be spoken exactly as written. Certain protective symbols had to be included with the burial in the correct configuration. Getting the details wrong wasn't treated as a minor stylistic issue. It was treated as a functional failure. The same way entering one wrong digit into a calculation gives you the wrong answer, no matter how sincerely you meant to get it right. Some spells even include explicit instructions about materials and timing, specific amulets made from specific stones, placed on specific parts of the body, recited at specific moments during the burial process. This level of procedural detail is closer to what you'd expect from a ritual manual designed by engineers than what most people picture when they imagine ancient religious texts. The underlying assumption seems to have been that the universe responds to precision, not sincerity alone. That good intentions, without correct execution, simply wouldn't produce the intended result. The clearest example of this precision is the judgment scene most people have at least glimpsed in surviving Egyptian art, the weighing of the heart. In this ritual, a person's heart, understood as the seat of a person's actions, intentions and character, is placed on one side of a scale, balanced against the feather of Mart on the other side. If the heart was heavier than the feather, weighed down by wrongdoing that violated Mart's order, the outcome was catastrophic. The heart would be devoured by a creature called Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, and the person's continued existence in the afterlife would end entirely, not through punishment exactly, but through simple erasure. Notice how this system is described. It isn't framed as a judge making a subjective decision based on how sympathetic your excuses sound. It's framed as a literal mechanism, a scale physically balancing two objects, producing a result based on actual weight. The moral content of a person's life is translated into something measurable, comparable, exact. There's no ambiguity built into the metaphor. A scale either balances or it doesn't, and no amount of pleading changes which way it tips. Alongside this, the deceased was expected to recite what's often called the negative confession, a list of wrongdoings they were declaring they had not committed, spoken directly to the assembled judges of the afterlife. Even this declaration follows a specific, repeated structure, phrase after phrase, almost like a checklist being read aloud, rather than a spontaneous personal plea for mercy. Surviving versions of this confession list dozens of specific offences, things like theft, dishonesty, cruelty toward animals, disturbing the peace of the community. Each denied in turn, addressed to a different divine judge by name, in a formula precise enough that scholars today can reconstruct it almost word for word across different burial sites. Scholars who study these texts closely note something else worth mentioning. Variations in wording and formula do exist across different copies of the Book of the Dead, produced across different periods and workshops. This isn't necessarily evidence against the idea of precision. It may simply reflect that different schools of priests maintain their own established, internally consistent versions of the correct formula, the same way different scientific traditions might use slightly different notations to describe the same underlying law, without disagreeing about the existence of the law itself. Put all of this together, and what you get is a picture of the afterlife that isn't chaotic, arbitrary, or dependent on the whims of a deity's mood that day. It's a system, precise, rule-based, applied the same way to every single person who ever lived, regardless of status, wealth, or how convincing their excuses might have been. Which raises an obvious question. Doesn't that sound a little bit like how we describe the physical universe today? Modern physics describes the universe in a way that, at its core, shares something important with what the Egyptians were describing through Ma'at. Physical laws, gravity, thermodynamics, the conservation of energy, don't care about intention, belief, or mood. They apply exactly and consistently, regardless of who is involved or what they wish were true. Drop an object, and it falls at a predictable rate whether you believe in gravity or not. The universe, as physics describes it, is not chaotic or arbitrary. It runs on fixed, exact rules that produce consistent outcomes given the same starting conditions. Even the language physicists use to describe these laws carries an odd echo of what the Egyptians were reaching for thousands of years earlier. Conservation laws state that certain quantities can't simply appear or disappear. Energy transforms, but the total amount stays constant, moving from one form into another rather than vanishing. That's structurally similar to the underlying logic of Mayat's judgment system. Nothing about a person's actions simply evaporates without consequence. It transforms into an outcome, weighed and accounted for, rather than disappearing into nothing. This is precisely the same intuition embedded in the concept of Mayat, just translated into a completely different vocabulary. Where physics uses mathematics and measurable forces, the Egyptians used moral and cosmic language, a heart, a feather, a scale. But the underlying claim is structurally identical. Reality is not random. It operates according to consistent, impartial rules, and violating those rules produces consequences that follow with the same reliability as any physical law. To be clear, this isn't a claim that Ma'at and modern physics are describing the literal same mechanism, or that ancient Egyptian priests had somehow anticipated quantum mechanics. That would be overstating the comparison in a way the evidence doesn't support. What's being pointed out here is something more interesting and more modest. Across a civilization with no access to mathematics, as we understand it today, no instruments, no experimental method in the modern sense, there was still a deeply held intuition that the universe functions according to exact, impartial rules rather than chaos or divine whim. That intuition turned out to be remarkably compatible with what science would eventually confirm through entirely different means thousands of years later. It's also worth noting how unusual this framing actually was for the ancient world. Many other ancient belief systems describe their gods as moody, arbitrary, prone to favoritism or random cruelty. Forces you had to appease rather than laws you could understand and align with. Mayat stands out specifically because of its impartial, rule-based character. It wasn't about pleasing a temperamental god. It was about aligning yourself with a fixed order that existed independently of anyone's mood, including in theory the gods themselves. That's the real significance of holding these two systems side by side. Not that ancient Egypt discovered physics in some literal sense, but that the same basic recognition that reality has structure, that structure is impartial, and that violating it has consequences, shows up independently in two completely different frameworks, separated by thousands of years and entirely different tools for understanding the world. When wildly different systems keep landing on the same underlying intuition, that intuition is usually worth taking seriously. It also raises a genuinely humbling question about how much of what any civilization believes is a product of its available tools rather than the underlying truth itself. The Egyptians didn't have equations, so they used a heart and a feather. We have equations, so we use symbols and numbers. But the tools might simply be different languages for describing the same discovery, that beneath the apparent randomness of daily experience, something consistent and impartial is actually running the show. It's worth remembering too that physics itself took centuries to move from rough observation to precise law. Newton's equations didn't arrive overnight. And even today, physicists continue refining and revising their models of how reality works at the deepest levels. Judged by that same standard, Ma'at looks less like a primitive myth and more like an early stage theory. The first rough draft of an idea that took humanity thousands of years and several completely different vocabularies to fully articulate, which makes it strange how differently we treat this idea today. If you tell someone that dropping a heavy object on their foot will hurt, nobody accuses you of being unscientific or superstitious. That's physics, plain and simple, universally accepted without controversy. But suggests that unkind or dishonest actions might have some kind of structured, non-random consequence, even framed loosely, without any specific religious claim attached. And the reaction shifts immediately. It becomes just a belief, something you're entitled to hold personally, sure, but not something anyone would treat as an actual operating principle of reality, the way we treat gravity. Part of this shift is understandable. Centuries of moral claims have been used to justify harm, control, and superstition dressed up as cosmic law, and a healthy skepticism toward the universe will punish you. Style thinking has protected plenty of people from manipulative ideologies. That skepticism isn't unreasonable, but somewhere in that necessary correction, an entire category of honest observation got thrown out along with the manipulation. The simple, repeatable noticing that actions tend to produce proportional outcomes, independent of any specific religious claim about why. This is a fairly recent shift, historically speaking. For most of human history, across most civilizations, the idea that moral action and cosmic structure were deeply connected wasn't a fringe belief. It was closer to a default assumption. The Egyptians weren't unusual for believing this. What's unusual by comparison is how thoroughly modern secular culture has separated these two categories, treating physical law as fact and any parallel claim about moral or spiritual cause and effect as pure opinion, with no space left in between for we're not fully sure, but the pattern is worth taking seriously. There's a cost to this separation that rarely gets discussed. When you fully strip away the possibility of structure from moral experience, the strange coincidences people notice in their own lives, the small acts of carelessness that seem to circle back, the unexpected generosity that seems to be met with unexpected fortune, get filed away as noise rather than treated as data worth paying attention to. Not because the pattern isn't real, but because we've collectively decided in advance that this particular category of pattern doesn't count as evidence of anything. The Egyptians didn't have that same blind spot. Whether or not their explanation was literally correct, their instinct to take the patterns seriously, to build an entire structured system around the idea that actions produce consistent, rule-based consequences, meant they were at least willing to look directly at something modern culture has largely trained itself to look away from. That willingness to look, more than any specific belief about scales or feathers, might be the part of their worldview most worth reclaiming. There's an interesting irony in how selectively this skepticism gets applied too. Plenty of people who would never call themselves superstitious still avoid tempting fate out loud, still feel a small pull toward reciprocating a kindness they didn't ask for, still sense that certain actions carry a weight the culture around them insists doesn't exist. The intuition hasn't disappeared, it's just been pushed underground, treated as something to feel privately but never defend out loud, for fear of sounding naive in a culture that has decided this particular category of observation isn't allowed to count. Egypt's version of this idea is remarkably well documented, but it's far from the only civilization that arrived at something similar. In Hermetic philosophy, a tradition with deep roots in the same region and era as ancient Egyptian thought. One of the foundational principles is often summarized as above, so below. At its core, this principle claims that the patterns governing the vast cosmic scale of reality and the patterns governing small-scale individual human life are not separate systems, but reflections of the same underlying order. It's a direct philosophical cousin to what Mayat describes. One consistent structure operating identically at every scale, rather than one set of rules for the universe and a completely different, disconnected set of rules for individual human choices. Independently, in Vedic and later Buddhist thought developing across South Asia, a related but distinct concept emerged: karma. Popular culture has flattened karma into something close to cosmic punishment. Do something bad, get punished. Do something good, get rewarded. But in its more precise philosophical formulations, karma describes something closer to a structured mechanism of cause and effect operating specifically in the domain of intention and action, not a moralizing force handing out rewards and punishments based on judgment. Action produces consequence consistently according to identifiable principles, in much the same procedural spirit as Mayat's scale weighing a heart against a feather. Some classical texts describing karma go into considerable technical detail about how intention, action, and consequence interact, distinguishing, for instance, between an action's immediate effects and its longer, more diffuse ripple effects across time, or between actions performed with full awareness versus actions performed carelessly or under compulsion. This level of granularity again mirrors the same underlying instinct found in Mayat, that the relationship between action and consequence isn't vague or emotional, but follows identifiable, describable structure, even if that structure is subtle enough to require careful study to understand. What's worth noticing here is the same pattern we've already seen elsewhere. Civilizations separated by enormous distances, with no meaningful contact or exchange of ideas, independently arriving at strikingly similar conclusions. Egypt's precise, scale-based judgment system, Hermetic philosophy's principle of structural correspondence across scales, Vedic and Buddhist karma's mechanism of consistent cause and effect, different vocabularies, different cultural contexts, entirely different cosmologies, and yet all converging on the same essential claim. The universe is not random, and human action fits into that non-random structure in a way that produces consistent, traceable consequences. That kind of independent convergence across cultures with no way of comparing notes is difficult to write off as simple coincidence. It suggests that whatever these civilizations were noticing, however incompletely or symbolically they described it, they were pointing at something real enough to keep discovering again and again in isolation from one another. It's tempting to assume that ancient trade routes or migration might explain away some of this overlap, that ideas simply travelled further than we usually assume, and in some cases, later contact between civilizations likely did allow some cross-pollination of philosophical ideas. But the earliest layers of each of these traditions predate any documented significant contact between Egypt, the Vedic world, and the broader Hermetic tradition that developed later. The core intuition, reality is governed by consistent, impartial structure, appears to have been arrived at independently in each case. before any of these civilizations had meaningful opportunity to borrow the idea from one another. There's also a Chinese philosophical tradition worth mentioning briefly here. The concept of the Tao, or the Way, which describes an underlying natural order that governs everything from the seasons to human conduct, and which humans can either align with or work against, with consequences following either choice. Once again, this tradition developed with no meaningful early contact with Egypt, the Vedic world, or the Mediterranean. And once again, it converges on the same fundamental claim. The cosmos has a structure. That structure applies to human behavior as much as to nature, and living out of step with it produces friction, not because of punishment, but because of simple structural mismatch. The way a gear grinds when it's forced against its natural rotation. To be clear, before going further, none of this is a suggestion to adopt a specific religious framework or to start interpreting every difficulty in your life as cosmic punishment for some past wrongdoing. That kind of thinking can easily tip into unhealthy guilt or magical thinking about things that are simply bad luck, illness or circumstance. And that's not what's being suggested here. What is worth taking from this is something more modest and more useful. The willingness to actually pay attention to patterns of cause and effect in your own life, rather than dismissing them by default before you've even looked closely. The Egyptians didn't build their entire moral and cosmological system by ignoring the patterns they noticed. They built it by taking those patterns seriously enough to study them carefully and describe them as precisely as they could, given the tools available to them. You can do a smaller, more grounded version of the same thing. When you notice a moment where carelessness seemed to circle back around, or generosity seemed to be met with unexpected return, resist the urge to immediately file it away as meaningless coincidence. You don't have to conclude anything supernatural is happening. Just let yourself actually notice the pattern, the way a scientist notices an anomaly worth investigating, rather than immediately dismissing it to protect an existing assumption. This is really just an argument for a particular kind of honesty. The willingness to let your own observed experience count as data, rather than automatically deferring to whichever explanation is most socially comfortable to hold. If you keep noticing the same kind of pattern over months or years, that repetition itself is worth respecting, regardless of whether you ever land on a fully satisfying explanation for why it happens. The Egyptians didn't wait for a complete theoretical explanation before taking Ma'at seriously. They took the patterns seriously first and built the explanation around what they observed. Over time, paying this kind of attention tends to change how deliberately you act. Not out of fear of cosmic punishment, but out of a grounded, observed sense that actions really do tend to produce consistent, traceable outcomes, even when the exact mechanism isn't fully clear. That's not blind faith. That's closer to the same kind of careful, repeated observation that built the Book of the Dead's precise system in the first place. Just applied to your own life, in your own time, without needing a scale or a feather to make the point. There's also a simple, practical habit worth borrowing from this framework. Stripped of any specific cosmology, before acting, especially in moments of frustration or temptation to cut a corner, ask a version of the question the Egyptians built their entire afterlife around. Is this action adding order or adding disorder to the situation I'm in? You don't need to believe a scale is literally weighing your heart to find that question useful. It's simply a way of taking your own actions seriously as things with real structured consequences, rather than treating them as disconnected from everything that follows. It's also worth applying this same attentiveness to how you interpret other people's actions towards you, not just your own. If someone's carelessness eventually seems to catch up with them, resist the urge to treat that as evidence of some cosmic justice being served on your behalf. That framing tends to curdle into quiet resentment or self-righteousness, waiting for other people's comeuppance rather than focusing on your own alignment. The value of this entire framework isn't in tracking other people's scales. It's in staying honest about your own. So go back to that feeling we started with. The quiet, hard to explain sense that life isn't actually random. That carelessness circles back. That generosity tends to return somehow in forms you didn't expect. An entire civilization took that feeling seriously enough to build a precise, structured system around it. Not vague spiritual comfort, but something closer to a technical description of how they believed reality actually worked. A scale, a feather, an exact, repeatable mechanism, applied consistently to every single person who ever lived, and independently, thousands of miles away and thousands of years apart, other civilizations kept arriving at strikingly similar conclusions, using entirely different language to describe what appears to be the same underlying intuition. None of this proves, in any scientific sense, that the universe operates exactly the way the Egyptians described. But it does suggest that the instinct you felt, that quiet sense that actions matter in some structured, non-random way, is not a modern superstition invented out of nowhere. It's one of the oldest, most widely shared intuitions humans have ever had about the nature of reality itself, showing up again and again across civilizations that never once compared notes. Maybe the feather never literally weighs anything. Maybe there's no scale, no crocodile-headed creature waiting at the edge of the afterlife. But the pattern underneath the metaphor, that structure exists, that consequences follow, that nothing simply vanishes without leaving a trace, keeps showing up everywhere humans have looked closely enough to notice it. That's not proof, but it's not nothing either. Whatever ends up being true about the exact mechanism, one thing seems clear across every civilization that's looked closely at this question. The people who took the pattern seriously, who paid attention rather than dismissing it, ended up with a framework for living more deliberately than the people who simply assumed none of it mattered. Whether that framework came from a scale, a wheel of karma, or a philosophical principle about correspondence across scales, the practical outcome was the same: closer attention to consequence and less willingness to treat any single action as disconnected from everything that follows it. Remember how we started. Gravity doesn't care whether you believe in it. Step off a ledge and you fall, whether or not you've ever heard the word physics. The Egyptians believed the same was true of Ma'at. You don't have to believe in it for it to apply. You just have to decide whether you'd rather understand the rules you're already living under, or keep pretending the ledge isn't there. If nothing else, that convergence is worth carrying with you the next time you catch yourself dismissing the feeling too quickly. If this changed how you think about the patterns in your own life, do me a favour and hit subscribe. We go deeper into what ancient wisdom actually understood about consciousness and reality every single week. And I want to know, have you ever noticed a moment in your own life that felt too precise, too proportional to be pure coincidence? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one.